Hey guys, today I'm going to be talking about chemistry in the Human Anatomy and Physiology 10th edition book. This is going to be chapter 2 titled Chemistry Comes to Life. This is going to be a bit of a complex chapter if you are just starting in science classes or if you've never taken a chemistry class before. So I'm going to try my best to explain what chemistry is, and hopefully by the end of this video you have a good sense of chemistry and you feel confident going into your next class. This chapter has two different sections. We're going to start off with basic chemistry. The first thing we've got to know is what is matter. Matter is anything that takes up space and has mass. And there are going to be three different states of matter. A gas, which has no definite shape or volume. A liquid, which has a definite volume, but it takes shape of its container. And solids, that has a definite shape and a definite volume. A very good example of this is water. If you freeze water, it turns into a solid, has a shape, volume. If you boil water, it turns into vapor, doesn't have a shape, nor volume. And if you just have a cup of water, it has a definite volume, but it takes the shape of what container it's in. I have an example here in the pictures of solid molecules, how they don't move, liquid molecules, how they're moving slightly, and then gas molecules, how they're moving all over rapidly. Next, we're going to talk about atoms and atomic structure. What are atoms? Atoms are the smallest units of elements that contain the properties of elements. To start, you're going to need to know these three things. Protons. Protons are positively charged. They tell the atomic number and define the element. Electrons are negatively charged, and that will equal the number of protons in an atom. Neutrons are going to be neutral, no charge. Protons plus neutrons will equal the atomic mass of the element. It is important to know this. Remember that P is positive and N is neutral. Next, we're going to be talking about chemical bonds. And to start, we're going to talk about ionic bonds. A good way to remember an ionic bond is it's a bond that takes. It takes away from another atom. The definition is a chemical bond that is formed by the transfer of one or more atoms. So when it takes from another element, it turns into an anion, which is a negatively charged ion. If it loses it, it turns into a cation, which is positively charged. Next, we're going to talk about covalent bonds. A good way to remember covalent bonds is that they share. They're the strongest bonds that involve electron sharing. If the sharing is equal, then that is considered nonpolar. If it is unequal, it is polar. Hydrogen bonds are the weakest of the three, and those bonds occur between molecules held together by polar covalent bonds. Next, we're going to be talking about chemical reactions. To start, we'll start with chemical equations, and a chemical equation is just a symbolic representation of a chemical reaction. An example is 2 hydrogens plus 1 oxygen yields H2O. In reactions, there's going to be things called reactants, and that is what is undergoing the change in a chemical reaction. There will also be products, and that will be your final result of a chemical reaction. Kind of like in the example above, how the 2 hydrogens plus 1 oxygen, that will give the final result of water, H2O. Now there are going to be 3 different types of chemical reactions. The first one is synthesis, or an anabolic reaction. These reactions join atoms or molecules together. The example given is A plus B yields AB. The next one is decomposition, which is a catabolic reaction. That is a reaction when molecules are broken down. So that is taking AB and breaking it back down to A plus B. And exchange reactions are where bonds are made and broken. The example given is AB plus C yields AC plus B. Now we're going to talk about the energy flows in the chemical reactions. There are only two, but they're going to be critical for you to remember. The first one is exergonic reactions, which is a reaction that has released energy. The second is endergonic reaction, and that is a reaction that absorbs the energy. And just remember endergonic and photosynthesis, because photosynthesis absorbs energy. Now that was basic chemistry. Now let's get on to the fun stuff. Now we're going to talk about biochem. To start, we're going to talk about inorganic compounds. And the most important inorganic compound that we all need to know is water. Water is the most abundant and important inorganic molecule because it makes around 60 to 80% of the volume of cells. Now, some functions of water is the polarity properties. Water is held together by polar covalent bonds. It participates in chemical reactions. It has a high heat capacity, which is good at heat absorption. And importantly, it is a lubricant, which cushions around certain body organs to protect it from physical trauma. Now on to salts. Salt is an ionic bond that contains no hydrogen, because if it did contain hydrogen, it will dissociate. And if you don't know what dissociate means, look at the picture I put down below. You can see in the picture there's a cube of salt in water. And you could see the water is going straight to the salt, and it's pulling it apart. Now on to acids and bases. Acids are substances that releases hydrogen in a detectable amount. Bases are proton acceptors. They take in hydrogen atoms at a detectable amount. pH is the measure of hydrogen ions in a substance, and you could actually see a pH scale that I put in as an example, with acidic being 1 through 6.9 and basic being from 7.1 to 14. If it meets in between, that's neutral. And buffers are important because that resists a large swing in pH. Now we're going to talk about organic compounds. The most important organic compound to start this is we're going to need to know what dehydration, synthesis, and hydrolysis is. And this is really important to know for the rest of this chapter. To start, we'll talk about dehydration synthesis, and that's where two monomers come together to make a polymer. The way they do this is by taking away H2O, taking away water to make the bond. And when the bond breaks, what they do is add water, and that's called hydrolysis. Now on to the four major classes of organic compounds: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. We'll start with carbohydrates. There are three types of carbohydrates: monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. Monosaccharides, which is mono, that means one, is a single ring carbohydrate. An example is fructose or glucose. Disaccharides, di means two. This is a two-ring carbohydrate which is formed by dehydration synthesis. That is sucrose, lactose. And a polysaccharide means many. This is a carbohydrate with more than two rings. An example is starch and cellulose. Now I've given examples here of a monosaccharide, disaccharide, and a polysaccharide. You can see mono, just one, disaccharide, two, and you can see that they're both connected through dehydration synthesis. A polysaccharide, more than two. Now on to lipids, and there are going to be four types of lipids: triglyceride, phospholipids, steroids, and eicosanoids. Start off with triglycerides. These are often referred to as neutral fats and provide the body with an efficient and compact form of energy. There are two of them. We'll start off with saturated fats. And a saturated fat is a fatty acid chain that has only single covalent bonds. It will be referred to as a solid, with hydrogen atoms will determine how solid it will remain at a given temperature. A good example is butter. How you put butter and you can leave it out and it still remains a solid. Unsaturated fats are a fatty acid chain that has one or more double bonds. An example is olive oil. I put a picture down below with a fatty acid chain for saturated and unsaturated fats. You can see the saturated is a straight line, and then you could see the unsaturated straight line until it has that double bond that bends it. That's the difference. Next, we'll go on to phospholipids. These are the chief components of the cell membrane and guide the transport of lipids in the plasma. This is important, they also make up the cell membranes. Another thing you will need to know, and this is a big word to know in this class, is phospholipids are amphipathic, which means that one side of the phospholipid is hydrophilic, water-loving, while the other side is hydrophobic, which means they hate water. You can see an example of phospholipids right in the bottom right corner. And you can see the hydrophilic heads with the water on the outside, and then the tails that are hydrophobic, absolutely no water inside. Now on to steroids. Steroids are important, and the most important steroid is cholesterol. They are vital to homeostasis and they make sex hormones. These are very important. Eicosanoids are found in the cell membrane and play a role in blood clotting, regulation of blood pressure, and labor contractions. Now we're going to go and talk about proteins. Proteins are just long chains of amino acids joined together by dehydration synthesis. Very important. The structures of proteins. Amino acids. There are 20 common types in the body, and they have two major parts. An amine group, which is basic or a base, and that is the acceptor, and an acid group, which is acidic, and that's the donor. And importantly, these are connected by a thing called peptide bonds that holds the amino acid together. You can see in the example below how those two are connected through dehydration synthesis. And that square in the middle, that is the peptide bond that holds it all together. Now there are 4 structural levels of organization, or protein shapes. The first is the primary structure, which is just an amino acid and a polypeptide chain. The second, secondary structure, forms spirals and beta-pleated sheets. Third is tertiary structures, made up of secondary structures folded up into one amino acid. And then quaternary structure, made up of 2 or more polypeptide chains combined to form a functional protein. I put an example below of what all four of them are. You could see the primary structure, pretty basic. Secondary structure, spiral, or it could again be a sheet, which is just kind of a folded up piece of paper if you think of it. The tertiary structure, you could see it's made up of a couple secondary structures all folded up into one little structure. And the quaternary structure is pretty big, messed up, and that's because it's made of polypeptide chains. Now into the types of proteins. We'll start with fibrous, which is mainly made up of tertiary and quaternary structures. These are very stable and provide mechanical support to body tissue. Now into globular, which are compact and have at least tertiary structures. These have a major role because they do a lot. They transport, they regulate pH, they regulate metabolism, they're a defense, and are molecular transport. Most importantly, they catalyze enzymes, and enzymes will increase the rate of a chemical reaction. Now, on a side note, this is very important as well. When protein-hydrogen bonds begin to break, pH level begins to drop, or if the temperature becomes above normal, the protein is said to become denatured. Denatured is a big word to know in this class. An example of denaturization is like cooking an egg. When you have an egg and you say fry the egg, you can't turn it back into a liquid. It is stuck the way it is. That is exactly what denaturization is. Now on to nucleic acids. Nucleic acids are composed of carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Structures of a nucleic acid is a double helix made up of adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. Now we'll talk about DNA and RNA. DNA is a carrier of genetic information. RNA acts as a messenger carrying instructions. Now finally, we're going to be talking about ATP, adenosine triphosphate. This is a usable form of energy for cells. When it does get used, a phosphate group gets taken out, and that turns it into ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, which again gets recycled and turned into ATP. Just most importantly, the thing to know about ATP is that it is energy. That will conclude this chapter. Hopefully, you have learned a lot and you feel confident going into class. Thank you very much for watching.